We are kicking off the very first webinar run by the Kościuszko Institute in cooperation with the British Embassy in Warsaw. This is the very first webinar titled Misinformation in Times of COVID-19. And it's been done to answer a bit the questions, how do we see and what does it mean to see the misinformation for us, and also how to tackle it from many layers. I would like to greet our audience, especially our distinguished panelists who are with me right now. And by saying that, a special kudos to Tim Moody, who represents the British Embassy. It's very important to mention also that it is the very British Embassy who made it possible to happen today as a sponsor of the event. I would like also to greet Nicola Aitken from Fullback, Olgierd Syczewski from CIPA, Paweł Terpiłowski from Demagog, and last but not least, Scott Brennan from the Oxford University. The webinar will take a form of the panel discussion. We will have 2 rounds of questions, and after that, a short Q&A session that will be a space provided for the audience to ask questions. As for myself, I am a Kościuszko Institute disinformation analyst, and I will be very happy and honored to moderate this very session. Before moving to the topic, as we would like to hear all the things that our experts would like to tell us, I would like to refer to a very short story that happened to me a few weeks ago when I was in Krakow and I took a cab. It was still a time when COVID-19 sounded a bit more scary than it is now, sadly. And my cab driver told me that he's not at all afraid of COVID because he has already bought his own portion of alkalic silver. And I guess this is a very good example what misinformation is. Because when we think of something a bit similar that gets way more attention than misinformation, it's a sister notion, disinformation, we usually associate it with some kind of fake news, and it all gets a little bit more ambiguous and blurry. But what is exactly misinformation? Misinformation, in a very brief introduction, is a kind of fake news or distorted information that doesn't necessarily have to try to influence our audience in a kind of malicious way. Sometimes it's being shared in a very genuine impression by somebody. Still, this information is fake. I'm pretty sure that the person who told me that alkalic silver is a fantastic weapon against COVID-19 actually believed that. Still, as we all know, it can be a dangerous weapon, but to werewolves and not exactly the coronavirus or COVID-19. And we, browsing in the internet, we notice a lot of distorted information and a lot of fake news that are not necessarily coordinated nor malicious, that still are to a certain degree dangerous, and they do not provide the actual view of the situation. The alkalic silver was an example of how people can be influenced by some kind of untrue information, and what does it mean exactly, what misinformation is, and how to tackle it from the academic perspective. I guess that will be told us a little bit more by Scott Brennan. And here I would like to start with the first question. So I would like to tell our audience that it's possible to ask your own questions in a chat, and we will see it a little bit later on, and it will be asked during the FAQ session. If, however, not all questions will be able to be answered during our limited time, we'll go back to you in emails to elaborate more and to tell you things you would like to know, of course. With that, I would like to start my first question to Scott Brennan. Dear Scott, you were a head lead of the recently published report, Types, Sources, and Claims of COVID-19 Misinformation. From what I know, this is not the only report that you have written on misinformation. Would you be as kind to briefly introduce the respective panel and all the audience to its findings, and tell a bit more about academic approach to misinformation? I would like to also ask all panelists just to answer in 5 or 6 minutes, so we can make 2 rounds and then fit it nicely. Scott.
Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. But first, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here and to speak with you all. So back in March, we realized that, despite this kind of growing recognition that, there was this huge problem of misinformation about COVID, there weren't really any systematic analyses of that misinformation and what it looked like. And so that's what the study that you mentioned was trying to do. And it came out in the beginning of April. And it looks just at the sort of, misinformation in the beginning part of the pandemic from the first 3 months. And what we did is we took a sample of pieces of misinformation that we identified from existing fact checks by third-party fact checkers. And the report that we published kind of lays out 5 key findings, and I'm going to try and go through all of them, but I promise I'll keep this short. So the first concerns the scale of the problem. And we saw very clearly that the number of fact checks, and therefore likely the pieces of misinformation, although obviously that connection is perhaps a little more complicated, but rose dramatically from January to March. It was something like a 900% increase. Like, that's not terribly surprising. Second concerns the sources of misinformation, right? Who's sharing it, who's spreading it. And again, unsurprisingly, we saw that it's coming both from the bottom up, from regular people, but also from prominent people as well, politicians, celebrities, influencers. But I think what's interesting here is that in our sample, while prominent people account for only about 20% of the pieces of misinformation, they accounted for nearly 70% of the engagements. So the third finding concerned the format, so the form that pieces of misinformation take. And we found about 60% of these pieces of content were what we call reconfigured. It involved twisting or recontextualizing or misinterpreting otherwise true content or real images, right, rather than being just wholly fabricated. And this is in line with a lot of other types of misinformation, not related to COVID. We also, interestingly, we saw a small amount of manipulated content, right? Images or videos that had been altered in some way, but none of it was deepfakes or other sort of AI-based, forms of manipulation, right? Despite all this a great deal of sort of concern about deepfakes, everything we saw sort of involved very simple video editing or tools or tools like Photoshop. Fourth, we looked at the claims that were made in these pieces of misinformation. And the most common sort of claim that we found concerned the actions or the inactions of public authorities, right? Governments, the WHO, the UN, things that they were doing or not doing. And I will just say that to me, this was probably the most surprising thing that we found. Right? I think going in, I expected, right, it would be all about sort of the health, health things, about COVID, potential cures or symptoms. But we saw just a huge amount of the sort of misinformation about what public authorities were doing. And then finally, just to give you some sort of sense of the response by the platforms, we looked at the number of pieces in our sample that were still available and unlabeled by the end of March on the platforms. And I think the most notable thing here is Facebook, right, despite having this explicit relationship with a lot of fact checkers, and already sort of at that time labeling content as false that was identified by these third-party fact checkers, about a quarter of the pieces of misinformation shared on Facebook were still available and unlabeled. So these are the 5 sort of key findings that of the report, and of course in your questions I'll be happy to go more in depth on any of them.
Yes, the very role of the social platforms in tackling disinformation is also very interesting, as all the time when they try to flag some kind of content that it's fake news, it's actually it worked in an opposite manner. People who didn't believe Facebook, they were even more prone to share it then, because it was some kind of hidden truth that they were spreading. And it was quite interesting how people react when you
Yeah.
flag something as false.
Sorry, if you don't mind, I'll just cut in. I mean, I think you're right to bring up, the potential of backfire effects, right? And I think that has been a concern for a long time. That being said, I do want to say I think the empirical evidence now is that fact checking actually works really well, and most of the time, in most cases, it actually is great. Like there's no problems. That's not to say that it can't be complicated, and we certainly need to worry about how fact checks might be spreading misinformation or these different ideas in different communities that wouldn't otherwise be reached. But I think it's important that to recognize that most of the time fact checking is incredibly effective.
This is true.
When picked up by platforms and integrated into the recommendation algorithms.
I'm very happy that you bring this up, as we have 3 fact checkers in the panel, and I'm sure that they're happy to hear that. This is extremely important to have fact checkers on our side when facing misinformation. And that being said, I would like to move to Nicola, as we know that this academic stand on disinformation is one side of the coin. Sometimes we have a bit different inputs from practitioners. And with regard to that, I would like to ask you a very similar question regarding misinformation and COVID-19 that was happening across social platforms. How does it look like in the eyes of a fact checker, and how does it differ from the academic standpoint? What kind of problems do you face in your daily work with COVID and misinformation?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. And I'm delighted to hear Scott say that fact checking is effective. I think I'll just start by saying, so FullFact is the UK's independent fact checking organisation. We're a charity, so we're completely independent from government and other formal organisations. But I should say that we are one of the partners through the Facebook third-party fact checking programme. So we fact check content found in the UK for Facebook and provide labels which are put onto the content that we decide is false or misleading or so on. So yeah, COVID-19 has been a real challenge for us. I mean, to start with a bit of context, at the end of last year, we were spending all of our time in preparation for the UK general election. So that was looking at politicians, looking at the political parties, what information they were putting out, looking at what was being reported in the newspapers. And then when COVID-19 started, actually, we had to pivot a lot more to what was happening on social media, to what was happening in more organic conversations. So what people were sharing themselves, ordinary people, as Scott sort of said. Don't get me wrong, there was still a lot of content that needed fact checked by the politicians and government as well, but actually it was a really different scenario from what we've done before. So in that sense, being a partner with Facebook was really, really helpful, because we were able to see in as close to real time as you can probably get what types of content was being shared that could potentially be false and misleading. So just to kind of pick up on that point a little bit, there are definitely some new trends that we have seen in terms of our day-to-day fact checking. The first I would say is the breadth of claims, which again Scott sort of picked up on. It's really different that actually a lot of the false information out there is causing real genuine harm. I think a lot of the misinformation that we've seen certainly in the UK in the last couple of years might be more focused on democracy or on politicians and political trust. Now, we could debate for forever what impact that has, but now we're seeing medical misinformation, health misinformation, which can actually cause real harm to people. So that kind of different type of claims, and as I mentioned, the breadth of claims as well. It's a really overwhelming amount of information for our small fact-checking team to try and get through. So we have to prioritise what claims we want to fact-check and prioritise based on harm predominantly. But it means that we can't get through everything. And Scott mentioned that actually there is still a lot of misinformation on Facebook that unfortunately hasn't been flagged. I think that's just due to the amount that's on there, unfortunately. So there's a breadth of claims, which is really different. Oh, sorry.
Go on, please.
I was going to say the second thing is actually how we respond to those claims. So a lot of what we've seen in COVID-19 has been very specific medical information. So If I can give an example of ibuprofen, the painkiller, which is commonly used, the advice on that has changed so much in the last couple of months. We first started fact-checking claims that said taking ibuprofen was harmful and you shouldn't be taking that. So our first fact check was there's no evidence that that's true. It's fine to take ibuprofen. Then the government and the WHO came out and said, actually, there is some evidence that ibuprofen might be dangerous. So we had to change our fact check and change it and say, actually, no, don't take ibuprofen. And then about a month ago, it changed again. And they said, actually, it is fine to take ibuprofen. So we had to change that fact check again. So actually, just being able to respond to this new evolving situation is really, really difficult. And in fact, full fact, we're not health professionals, so we don't necessarily have the expertise to take the final decision on a lot of this. So we need to rely on our contacts in the NHS or in Public Health England in the UK, and sometimes those contacts are really, really busy, as the rest of us. So actually having access to the expertise to fact check a lot of this stuff can be quite difficult.
Thank you for that. You made a few interesting points here, especially the troubled communication. That was one of all the things that we witnessed, especially in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. But also what drew my attention was scenarios and types. And this is very true that sometimes we do have just health-related misinformation, but it's not only in a subjective manner different from time to time. Sometimes we get misinformation that I think is typical for certain region or some kind of environment. And I would like to ask Olgierd a bit more about this phenomenon. If you have ever encountered something, you could say it was a regional or national type of misinformation that was targeted to a specific audience in your practice.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I am very happy to be here and join the discussion. Just to give you some background, I was monitoring specifically COVID-19 disinformation in Poland for more than 3 months. So, I was following narratives on day-by-day basis. And we can say that there were some exact narratives which were targeting Poland. For example, the very specific one was claiming that Ukrainian minority is bringing the virus itself to Poland. This was the very original one. We can easily assume who created this kind of narrative, but it was the using some societies differentiations just to show and to create some destabilization in the society. But of course, we could see in Poland both the general narratives that were visible in other countries, like anti-establishment ones, anti-vaccine movements were very active during the pandemic. Of course, and I'm not sure if that was a problem in other countries, we must remember that COVID-19 is very specific, let's say, event, because at start nobody knew what is the fact. I mean, people are not doctors, people are not specialists in military handling the pandemic crisis, right? So it was a completely new environment, even for fact checkers or people who are dealing with the disinformation, because it was hard to establish what is the truth, right? The great example of ibuprofen was also in Poland, and if you would check with 3 doctors, probably you would get 3 different answers. So it's a very hard environment to even fact check when you don't know what is true, and this was a real challenge. Second challenge, and very specific for Poland, was that we were heading towards presidential elections during the times of pandemic. So it created a lot of environment for disinformation and misinformation. So there were a lot of accusations that government is doing the lockdown on purpose to push elections for the later time, which will be more convenient for government. Or there was a second oppositional thought that government is using the pandemic and the information and narrative that the Polish government is handling well the situation to promote themselves within the society to get some votes. So let's say the events like elections were also kind of the boost for very specific narratives, And of course, we could saw also the narrative which was saying that all democratic governments are not prepared to handle this kind of crisis situation. And if you have strong leader who is like a one-man decider, this kind of government is far more effective in handling the crisis. So I think these were like the most eye-catching narratives towards disinformation and misinformation about COVID-19.
I do remember it. All the deep state and NWO type of theories, they were very much present during COVID-19 and from the misinformation angle. But you brought something else that's also very important in a way, how to tackle this crisis. As our audience is probably aware, it is called infodemics very popularly as pandemic and this surge of misinformation is especially present. So that makes together infodemic, and the question is how to tackle it. And as you brought the government and public policy somewhere in the context, I would like to switch to Tim to ask him a little bit more on the UK government stand on how to tackle the misinformation. Is it kind of a threat that needs to be addressed on many levels? And also, what's the position of the UK government when it comes to the collaboration with NATO and EU allies with this respect?
Thanks, Kamil. Great questions. A couple of questions there for me to pick up. Firstly, just to echo what other panelists have said, thanks very much for the Kosciuszko Institute for hosting this event. As you mentioned, we're really keen to partner with you on this. We think it's a really important topic, exactly to bring this type of forums together with kind of government, academia, and the private sector together. And also, as you'll particularly know, we work very closely each year with you ahead and at Cybersec. So this is a great way to lead into that. I will start with one caveat that, I'm here representing the British Embassy, which of course by definition and extension represents the UK government, but I wouldn't like to pretend that I'm representing the expertise and the breadth of the UK London-led experts on this level. So do please factor that in for fellow panelists and for colleagues looking at it on YouTube later. But in terms of how the UK government addresses this, I would say that we look at it through a kind of misinformation and disinformation lens. Clearly, I've been actually reading a book about the origins of the Congo at the moment. And back in the 19th century, misinformation and disinformation was one of the main strands that King Leopold used to gain control of the Congo by telling different groups in different countries different things about how he wanted to kind of colonize it, because he knew that if he told them what he wanted to do, bigger countries would say, no way, you're not having that much space. So the concepts have been around for hundreds of years, but I think when you couple that with the modern spread of the internet and the way we can get information to all corners of the globe within sort of a click of a button, that's kind of the new mutated version of what we're dealing with. So at the UK end, in terms of what we do, we're actively now developing and deploying measures, and have been for a number of months, around responding to misinformation and COVID-19. And I think broadly that falls into two categories. One is awareness raising of the issue, and secondly, it's collaborating with partners, and that may be international partners, in my case with Poland. It may be domestic partners such as fact checkers and others in the UK end. And the way we've kind of brought it together at the UK end is via kind of standing up a cross-government counter-disinformation unit, which actually stood up on the 5th of March, so very early into this crisis, which brought together the whole cross-government monitoring and analysis capabilities together. And the aim of that unit is to give this comprehensive picture of the extent, the scope and the reach of disinformation and misinformation around COVID, and to work with partners to help ensure the right action is taken. And just very briefly on the kind of two areas I mentioned, how we're awareness raising. Well, we're particularly looking at promoting resilience to the harmful false narratives around COVID-19 diagnostics, treatments and vaccines, with a kind of communications campaign that increases skepticism of that misinformation. and we're also raising awareness of the techniques that have been used. But I think, as Scott said at the start, this has all changed a lot in the 3 or 4 months since March. So the approach also has to be pretty flexible in responding to a changing dynamic. I just wanted to draw attention to one particular kind of campaign that was run, which is called Stop the Spread, a UK government campaign in partnership with the World Health Organization. And its aim was to combat the spread of health-related misinformation, and was dubbed an infodemic, as you mentioned, Camille, earlier, indeed by the World Health Organization. And I think this type of work is really important because misinformation has caused populations to take inaccurate precautions, create misunderstandings about the causes of it, such as your analogy at the start. And it's also been linked to increased social tensions that particularly target minority populations. So in a very brief nutshell, that's what the UK government has done and how we've coordinated. You asked about working particularly with partners and NATO partners. I can talk mainly about what we do with Poland, but I know this has been happening particularly across the European Union, but also across wider NATO partners too. And of course, we're committed to working towards the safety of the UK and our allies. And partnerships around technology are even more vital than ever before now. So one thing we've done with Poland, for example, I'm very happy to say, is that for the last couple of years, we've been working really closely on particularly disinformation. So for example, the Cabinet Office in the UK, which kind of coordinates our cross-government work, has been running training and capacity building programs with the Polish government, again, across the breadth of the Polish government, via their new Foreign Ministry Strategic Comms unit, to upskill and to share some of these messages. So we had a UK campaign around Don't Feed the Beast in, I think, March, which was also rolled out across a number of EU countries and NATO partners, using, in this case, Polish language in Poland and different language clearly in other places. And we've run that in parallel, often with our Polish counterparts here in the Foreign Ministry. And when our 2 prime ministers spoke a few weeks ago, actually, one of the things they agreed as part of a broad action plan on what we do generally between 2 countries was to continue this really important disinformation work, which I think, as you set out at the start, misinformation is definitely a facet of disinformation. There's a sliding scale, but we're using these networks that we've established over the last 2 years and partnerships with Poland to look at both disinformation, but also misinformation, and in this case, the work around COVID.
It's really reassuring to hear that there's such a great potential in international collaboration. I fully agree that raising awareness and resilience building is one of the most important goals we need to achieve when we would like to face challenges like COVID. And collaboration is something that I personally see as something that is necessary, absolutely. In the view of that, I would like to ask the last question of this round to Paweł. As I know that Paweł has frequently engaged itself in collaboration with the Polish government. And I would like to know, how does it look like from the perspective of a think tank and fact-checking organization when you think of this type of collaboration with Polish government? How does it look like in practice? Also, I would like to know whether there is a distinction, at least in the Polish environment, between misinformation and disinformation. Paweł, could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Well, first of all, I think that currently our government recognizes the importance and the impact of misinformation and disinformation surrounding the COVID-19, but I think it's a result from that pandemic at what we are experiencing right now. Because frankly, I think that before the pandemic, our government and perhaps others weren't exactly prepared to act on such scale to defend the informational security, and there was no clear communication strategy. And we experienced it in Poland in cases like when in the beginning of pandemic we had this very positive image of Minister of Health Łukasz Szumowski, which was very trusted public figure, but it quickly fell down due to confusing messages that were voicing. For example, in one of the interviews, he said that people will need to wear masks until the vaccine is ready. And afterwards, we got loosening of mask restrictions, so people quickly deemed him unreliable, simply. There was also a case of faulty masks which were bought by the Polish government, and those accusations which originated in media were firstly dismissed, but then it was acknowledged that that was indeed that case. That was the case. So those are like just few examples of conflicting messages that are coming from, the official statements, reliable, trusted sources, that I think create confusion and they build mistrust among the society about what's going on. And as it was mentioned, it also got very politicized by the opposition, because when some topic becomes political, when we have elections context, it's very hard to untangle it and get the truth. We had narratives voiced by some of the politicians that the government is maybe hiding something, that they demand the truth and reliable data. Those kinds of narratives only fuel conspiracy theories and misinformation, unfortunately. So what we need in the context of fighting this misinformation and disinformation in regards not only to COVID-19, but also another harmful narratives that are very much present in Poland, like anti-5G movements or anti-vaxxers, is the comprehensive approach to this issue, and government needs to set the framework for cooperation between its agencies and ministries, and also private sector, in order to synergize their efforts. For instance, Polish government created this fact-checking project made by a Polish press agency called Fake Hunters. That we prepared some workshops for the volunteers of this project. So this is one of example that I think was an ad hoc activity to tackle this misinformation, but I think it didn't get enough reach in order to effectively fight the misinformation. Because those efforts that our government is doing must be targeted at potential victims of misinformation. And right now, I think this reliable data, trustworthy sources of information, they don't exactly reach to those who needs it. We have popular celebrities which are openly questioning the very existence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, they gather significantly more reach than reliable information from trusted sources. So I think every government, not only Polish one, should ask itself why people tend to believe more in what some uneducated actress or singer has to say about the pandemic rather than the health agencies and experts and WHO or fact checkers. So this mistrust to the official data, to the official information is present, and I think it's one of the key issues that our government and others are facing.
You have mentioned three elements in your utterance that I find very important. First of all is that synergy effect that I get from the general opinions of all of our panelists, that we are more or less like-minded in this regard, and also that there is a need to have a clear information, and last but not least, to think how to regain trust and how to prevent distrust from being harmed in any way. It's very difficult to create information society without this basic trust to authorities and to certain fact-checking and international organizations.
Yes, it's very hard to build the trust, but it's very easy to lose one.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I would like to ask one more question to Tim. As we have noticed, a week or 2 weeks ago, there was a shift in the policies of certain big media platforms. Reddit, Twitter, Twitch, they have all adjusted their policing practices, trying to control what kind of message is being sent and published in those social networks. And on the other hand, we've got Facebook. Facebook has got a bit different approach, trying to fight the political ads, for example, but generally supporting the idea of being just a forum. And I would like to ask you, what is your stance on the collaboration with private companies in, of course, I mean the social media platforms, and what should they do to help? Which of the ways is your preferred? More an active engagement and policing of the content that is being uploaded, or more being a forum and trying to keep it a bit more formal, still more open than the previous one?
Great. Well, I'll do my best to answer that, but I suspect colleagues based in the UK will also want to come in with their opinions afterwards from their slightly different standpoints. But I think, as you said, we all agree here, and I think that's because it's the right answer, that it's vitally important that government, industry, civil society all come together to respond to the threat of misinformation and disinformation, and that tackling it really does require that whole of society approach. And sometimes we say this as a kind of just an easy answer to some things, but I think in the case of disinformation, misinformation, and stuff that's going out on the internet, it absolutely is true. There's no way that only government can tackle it, or only civil society, or only the private sector. It really does need everything. And actually, just one analogy on that is that in March, I think a week before pretty much COVID lockdown hit Poland, we actually held an event right here in the embassy today, downstairs, jointly with the US embassy and the Polish government, to bring together exactly that in Poland. The Polish government, UK government representatives from the Cabinet Office, social media organizations, and the private sector here in Poland, to start to discuss some of these issues around disinformation. It was, rather than COVID, but it was, I think, a really good example of what everyone sees the need to do. The difficulty is, particularly with COVID, this is a totally new concept. Yes, pandemics aren't anything new, but COVID is a new thing that's being learned by all of us as we go along. So trying to tackle something that's constantly changing, using tools that it's already hard to work across society and across government and the private sector anyway, but doing that on a moving feast is pretty hard to do. So but it also means you need to work even harder at it and communicate even better across what you do. So just maybe touching back on what I mentioned earlier, the UK government counter-disinformation unit. I think if I go into a little bit of detail about what they do, it might help to explain how we, particularly in the UK government, are looking to work across the different sectors. In terms of their remit with the third sector, they engage with disinformation specialists from civil society and academia in order to get that comprehensive overview of the extent, scope, and impact of dis and misinformation, and work particularly closely with social media platforms to identify and remove incorrect claims around COVID-19, in this case, to also provide authoritative sources of information and to explore how they can further limit the spread of misinformation on those platforms. And of course, we've heard today that there's a really important role to play by independent fact checkers and researchers, not just government affiliated ones, not just private sector ones. Because ultimately our democracies are built on providing that free, open, trusted forums for discussion and debate that allow different voices to be heard. You asked about some of the focus areas that you think are important. I think digital literacy skills and media literacy is really important to upskill not just young people, but the people across all the spectrums to be aware of some of these risks and to not trust instant headlines and so on, and to look a little bit behind that. I just want to touch on one example around, there was a case study around 5G and COVID where there were spurious claims about it, and then masks were being burned down in the UK and elsewhere. And I know that through this disinformation unit in the UK government, they did some close engagement with platforms around this 5G COVID disinformation, or misinformation in this case. And partially, let's not claim total credit, but partially a result of that pressure, they did change their terms and conditions, which meant unhelpful content could be taken down instantly. And then going forward, if there is new content that would go up tomorrow about this, it could happen much more quickly than it previously was.
It's a very interesting take from the public policy perspective. Before we move forward, I would like to ask one more follow-up question to Paweł. In the context of this cooperation between public and private entities, especially the social media platforms, how do you think those policies should be outlined to match the needs of fact checkers and to make it practically useful to achieve this effect of synergy that you earlier mentioned? And what's the most important thing that social media companies should do to keep the misinformation out of their platforms? What's the most effective tool in your understanding?
Well, first of all, I think that there is a general consensus among the fact-checking community that social media platforms and other companies that are media companies there's desperate need to do more about the fighting misinformation and disinformation, and it always comes down to the line between fighting it and, for instance, freedom of free speech, whether or not we should label something as false or reduce the reach or even delete it from the platform. And ultimately, I think that I don't see that the cooperation between governments and the platforms, social media platforms, will prove fruitful in this context because social media platforms work globally, and all of the governments are just for themselves, for their countries, and the law is very different in many cases. So I don't think that there will be something like one legal approach to fighting the disinformation and misinformation which can be copy pasted in. I think that it will come down in the end to what policies those social media platforms will apply and what measures they will take in order to fight this. I think, like, for now, Facebook is doing this, I think, pretty well. But if you look at this, Facebook is getting backlash from two different perspectives, which are rather counter to one another. From one side, you can see that Facebook is being criticized on that they are not doing enough work to fight the disinformation and misinformation, because, for instance, he's not taking down the post by Donald Trump or some other politicians which are for some spreading misinformation about the COVID-19 or other things. And on the other hand, you have clear misinformation and disinformation actors that are promoting that agenda and views, narratives that, for instance, our work as fact checkers, Full Fact, Demagog, or others, that we are doing what is practically censorship for them, and we are violating their freedom of speech because they are allowed to say whatever they want. So ultimately, I think this will come down to what policies should Facebook, Twitter, and Google or other cases should apply.
So this is a little bit different view on how to achieve this effect of synergy and how to proceed with social media platforms as allies in fighting the disinformation and misinformation, of course. Now, as we understand a bit more the difference between the two, and we see what should be done, and that we need all of the actors on board to tackle the crisis, we can also see the another very interesting phenomenon. When we read press articles and we hear the news, many times you can hear that there was life before COVID and life after COVID. That's a bit different, that things have changed. We've got now better policies, we've got now a kind of incident responding practice to something like a global pandemic. Maybe there were a lot of problems with communications and other issues, especially in the early phases. It is undeniable that something has changed, And with that, I would like to ask a question to Nicola. As this footprint of COVID is evident in many areas of our life, I would like to ask you, is there any specific change between what was considered misinformation before and what's after? Is there any changes in the landscape? Can we really say, for example, that before COVID, misinformation was a part of the news distortions, but now it's completely different and as it's omnipresent? And is there more misinformation than it was before, or is it just more different topics earlier? And I would like to pin on that a little bit. Could you please elaborate on how COVID changed the misinformation landscape?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really difficult question, actually. I think we can certainly say that some things have changed. And as I mentioned before, just within Full Fact, we've changed the way that we operate a little bit by looking a little bit more at what content is being shared on social media. And when I say social media, actually, another change has been what platforms we look at. So I think there's a lot of attention being put on Facebook and Twitter, quite rightly. There's a lot of misinformation on those platforms. But a change that we've noticed, certainly in the UK, is that there's more and more misinformation being shared on platforms like WhatsApp, for example, which was a trend in other countries pre-COVID-19, but hadn't really come to the UK yet. I think it's certainly here now. But what's really difficult about that type of misinformation is that and I think this was mentioned before, I think COVID misinformation doesn't necessarily have an agenda behind it in the way that we might have seen in previous years. I think it's a lot of people who are genuinely concerned, genuinely worried for their health and the health of their friends and family, and are just trying to help by spreading the information that they come across online. And I think that changes how we respond to misinformation as well. So, where you can identify a malicious agenda, you can take perhaps a stronger response. Where it's just, your auntie who is trying to make sure that you stay fit and healthy, actually you've got to treat that differently. We mentioned before the fact that the social media platforms have changed how they respond. I hope that continues. I think they've taken a lot stronger action against misinformation now than they have ever before, even in the run-up to elections, and I hope that a lot of that sticks around. Tim spoke about 5G and the fact that 5G has had real-world impact in the UK in terms of people trying to, burn down towers, attack people who were laying the infrastructure around it. That's obviously really concerning. The narrative that 5G causes harm, and actually the narrative that 4G causes harm and 3G causes harm, has been around for years. Full Fact actually published a report and spoke to Facebook and the UK government about this last year and said, we've seen a lot of 5G misinformation, we think it's going to become a problem. It's really unfortunate that we were proven right in that. So I think that actually, a lot of this has been around before. It's not new necessarily, but how people are responding to it is new. People are sharing it more, people are believing it more, and I think that's a really worrying trend that we need to think about. So in terms of what this changes going forward, I think Tim's absolutely right in talking about media literacy. I think that's really, really important, but also changing it from somebody might want to try and cause harm by influencing you to actually, you yourself have to take personal responsibility for this. I think a lot of the media literacy before has been on, hostile actors are potentially trying to cause mischief. Actually, this circumstance is not people trying to cause mischief, it's people trying to help each other out, but unfortunately being wrong.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting to see how it impacted the whole landscape environment of misinformation. And I'm also aware that sometimes misinformation and disinformation can be mixed and can be spotted in the very same area. And with that, I would like to direct one more question to Olgerd, as we have been talking about misinformation and disinformation before and specific examples. I would like to know what is the biggest challenge in fighting misinformation as opposed to disinformation? Is there any difference at all when you try to reach it? And also, what kind of allies are needed to prevent misinformation being spread as it is now on such a large scale from the perspective of engaged society representative?
Honestly, I'm not a huge optimist, and I think, honestly, using military terms, that we are at war, informational war, and I think we are losing it, and we are not making any kind of progress because we are still reactive. I mean, we are discussing our attitude and strategies after the pandemic, and we will, if something new will happen, we'll still be not prepared, and we're gonna afterwards discuss again and trying to have lessons learned. I think the crucial thing, and I cannot agree more with Tim, education is the most important aspect, because only resilient societies, resilient people will be able to stop spreading the misinformation and disinformation. I cannot see the difference in our attitude towards that, and I think educating from the youngest generation would be crucial to create a new kind of society which will have more digital hygiene and will be more critical towards the content you see in the internet. And just to follow up to what Pavel said, the celebrities who are spreading misinformation played a huge role in Poland, and this mechanism is pretty known. It's called influencer marketing, right? The influencers, so-called influencers, they advertising some kind of products, and their let's say their public status makes the product more credible. And it's the same with fake news and disinformation, right? If some celebrity will tell you or will say some doubt regarding, for example, vaccination, like famous Polish singer Edyta Górniak, it makes it more and more clickable in the media sphere, right? So this articles describing that celebrity is skeptic towards vaccination went viral. So this is the mechanism that internet works. I think there is no easy way to fight with that. I really believe in education. And second one is cooperation, but cooperation on international level, not only inside countries, cross industries and specializations, but we should discuss it on very international level, that people will exchange their views, their strategies, because internet is common for whole world, right? And I think we should create synergy and some kind of coherency between countries to be prepared for big global public misinformation campaigns that can come in future, because COVID was unexpected, so we are not sure what will come next, right? And we should be far more prepared for unexpected, if that's possible. And this is what I would stress really a lot. Education and cooperation are true crucial factors. And just side note, I really think that UK government is doing a very good job on both angles. I mean, I participated in events for communication and disinfo analysts in Poland to exchange the views. And also, I know that British government is supporting international cooperation towards monitoring disinformation. So I think this is a good strategy. I would love to see more countries doing similar things, honestly.
Yes, prepare for the unexpected developments. This is kind of a gray swan in risk management. And to pin on this all what we just heard, the need of synergy, the trust, the clarity of message, and all the needs for collaboration, and a kind of, if I can say so, holistic approach to the problem. I would like to go to our last panelist, Scott, to know a little bit more. What kind of recommendations can be really driven from the world of academia to reach the practitioners and public policy representatives, fact checkers, civil society, and and of course social media platforms, all of the actors that work together and fight together disinformation as an issue. Could you please tell us a bit more what academia has to offer, what would you like to recommend, and what are the warnings from the side of the academia in this whole process?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm not gonna like pretend that I can speak for all of academia and all of the huge amount of research being done in academia on this and disinformation. And yeah, so I'll try and just stay kind of focused on, you know, maybe the recommendations and the insights that we've been talking about, or related to what we've been talking about from my research. Kind of specifically, because I mean, as you know, in academia, we love to argue and disagree, and so there's no such thing as a consensus. But first, you know, I will say, you know, as an academic, right, I'm like required to just sort of first say that we need a lot more study, right? We need a lot more research into these questions. But I think we have to sort of address the fact that, you know, we have this huge problem, which is a lot of this misinformation and disinformation, right, happens on platforms. Platforms control the data, right? Like they're like you have to go through the platforms to get the data. And let's just say that some platforms are more willing to be open and transparent in terms of data sharing. And so this is something that we're going to really, you know, I suppose you could call this a recommendation, right? You know, and I suppose this speaks to the sort of needs of cooperation between platforms, government, and academia. And I think, in a sense, like this is all the more important, you know, given a few things, right? You know, most of the academic research has focused on the big platforms. I forget, someone already said this. And you know, with good reason. However, I think there's also reason to think that you know, there's a need to sort of look at some of the smaller platforms. In my research, I've seen a lot of people especially in like conspiracy communities, moving to other smaller platforms. We have no idea what's going on those platforms in any sort of systematic way, and so we need a lot more study on that. I think this other big, you know, issue is, you know, Facebook, for example, has done a pretty good job at getting out a lot of junk, you know, misinformation, disinformation out of people's, you know, news feeds. But they have a real problem with private groups, and that's where a lot of this junk is circulating. It can be really hard for researchers to do much with that, for a whole host of reasons, right? There's ethical issues, right, for researchers, academic researchers, about getting in and but there's also just the, you know, Facebook's well, let's say hesitance to provide good data on what's going on in those private groups. And of course, right, this question of what's going on in private messaging, I think, is really important, right? I think WhatsApp and other private messaging services are more and more important, and it's just you know, it's incredibly difficult, right, for academics to study that. You can imagine, right, especially something like WhatsApp, which is end-to-end encrypted. But as far as like more concrete recommendations, I guess, you know, I guess a few other things I'd like to say. So first, as it relates to fact checking, and I guess I should say first that you know, I'm cognizant that we have 3 fact checkers here. But you know, I'll just say that it seemed, you know, as far as I can tell, you know, the response to COVID has involved what I think has been the biggest mobilization of fact checking around a single issue. And I think it's really shown just how essential fact checking is and how important it is. And we've really asked a great deal of fact checkers to devote all of their resources to fact checking COVID content. And so I think it's really important to recognize that they certainly need more support. You know, they're always fact checking is always a sort of limited resource, and so much more, you know, there's so much more content out there that they cannot get to. In that sense, it's really important that you know, they have support from a wide array of different institutions beyond just platforms, right? And at the same time, right, it's really important that fact checkers maintain their independence. And so, you know, I'm just as a sort of plug for another project I'm working on, but I'm doing this series of interviews with people whose content has been fact checked, and which has been pretty fascinating. But I think most importantly, what stands out to me is that no one has any clue how fact checking works or how content moderation works. So many people I've spoken to do not understand that fact checkers do not work for Facebook. And they do not understand that they are independent and have, you know, most of them at least, like a rigorous commitment to being objective in displaying good information. And so in that sense, I think it's, fact checkers and platforms both, given the sort of relationship, right, between a lot of fact checkers and Facebook, do more to sort of, to tell the story about what they're doing. And fact checkers can certainly tell more, do a little bit a better job about letting people know who they are and what they stand for. And since as it concerns public authorities, going back to what I sort of talked about, I guess, at the beginning, I think there's good reason to think that they need to sort of step up their game too, right? When public authorities don't do a very good job of communicating what's going on, what their plan is, right? Misinformation may sort of fill in the gaps. And I think that sort of explains how in our data, so many of the sort of claims concern just what public authorities are doing. But at the same time, right, we must remember that misinformation often comes from the top. And we see this in our data, and we've been talking, the other panelists have been talking about as well. And I think this is especially important, right, as the whole pandemic's become just increasingly politicized, right? It's a huge problem, right? When your uncle shares a post that says you can prevent COVID by spending time in the sauna, but it's also a problem when the leader of your country spreads false claims about disinfectant or hydroxychloroquine or face masks. And so we really need to think about that. And of course, as it concerns these sort of prominent people or politicians, right? The real issue of platforms is they haven't always been very consistent in enforcing their existing policies. You were talking before about the sort of new policies that platforms have had. That's true. They have adopted a whole lot of new policies, but unfortunately, they haven't been terribly consistent in how they've enforced both the policies that they've already had and the new ones as well. And I think in that sense, I'll just sort of end here that as it relates to platforms, I think we have to remember that they are sort of the central actors here, and they have a huge influence on how misinformation, mis and disinformation sort of spreads. And they've definitely sort of been really just in the process of figuring out what they should even be doing. And unfortunately, over the 6 months, of the pandemic, they've been often really reactive instead of sort of proactive, and always been sort of behind the curve. And so I think we need to sort of, work to encourage the platforms to invest a little bit more sort of thought and money into the problem.
Can I add
true.
some points to that?
Of course. Go on.
Just in terms of being proactive, I completely agree. So, I mentioned that actually we'd seen some of the harm that could be caused by 5G narratives over a year ago. I think we need to be looking ahead at what's coming next. So, there's a lot of talk about a vaccine being, created. We know that anti-vaccination content already has a hold on various parts of social media. I think we need to be thinking now about how we respond to that and how we prevent that. And my second point that I would add to that is just around the social media companies themselves and what they're doing. What they do has such an impact on the information that is shared. It has such real consequences and potential consequences for things like freedom of speech. It's our view that actually the social media platforms as private companies shouldn't be making those decisions themselves. We think that governments ought to be giving direction. And I know that the EU has started making moves in this space. Unfortunately, the UK has been talking about legislation for over 2 years and hasn't introduced it yet. I think that's a really concrete step that could be done in the near future. That would have a really big impact.
It's all true, especially what you just added, that there is a kind of race between the two, and that misinformation adapts in a way. It changes, it moves to different platforms. As was mentioned by Scott, investigating and fact-checking things that is being shared on WhatsApp, but also on Signal or Telegram, it's becoming increasingly difficult as it's all end-to-end encrypted. And basically, even if you would like to perform a proper OSINT on what is actually happening on those closed groups, it's sometimes extremely difficult. And as we have noticed recently, certain ideas and certain types of misinformation are going from the big tech companies, from Twitter, from Facebook, and really to different new ones that are emerging, like Gab or like Parler, which is an alternative, so-called the free speech alternative to Twitter, which is also telling. So as we see this type of problem, this type of challenge is not only a challenge that is regional, that needs to be tackled on different areas and with different type of measures, with public policies, with public money also streamlined to fact checkers and civil society organizations that are very much needed in the quality assessments and checking of type of information that is being shared and whether it's true or not. The challenge itself is very complex, and I don't think it's very easy to answer the short question: what can be done and what should we do to fully make misinformation to minimum as it evolves with us. Hopefully, there is some kind of understanding and recognition of the problem becoming increasingly present between different types of social actors, which brings a kind of hope. And let's see how it evolves in the next months and years, and see what can be actually done with the means we have and with the environment we are witnessing. That being said, I would like to thank all the panelists for your inputs and in your thoughts in this very interesting topic. I would like also to thank our audience and ask everybody to stay with us a couple of minutes longer, as it's a great time to have a short Q&A session between the audience and our panelists. I would like to ask you to ask the questions with a specific person being mentioned. It would be a bit easier to contact and direct that person to answer the question that was asked. And last but not least, I would like to ask everyone who has been attending or is listening later to this webinar on YouTube. We're going to have a second webinar on 28th of July, so please watch us and stay tuned. With that, I would like to ask the first question, which is to Tim. It's a rather technical one, so I don't know if you will be able to speak out of your memory with your portfolio, but let's see how it goes. In terms of awareness raising and collaboration with partners, which strategies or methods or particular action plans has the UK government used which you regard as a success and can be easily replicated in other countries, particularly in Africa? So good practices and successes of Britain.
Sure, Kamil. I'll do my best to answer that from, as you said, my slightly limited standpoint here in Poland. Part of the job of diplomats is to talk broadly across all sorts of themes. Also, I was posted in Africa for the last 6 years before I came to Poland, in Rwanda, Burundi, and South Africa. So I've got a little bit of knowledge of working there. But just maybe before we get into the depth there, one, I think you just mentioned the next webinar is going to be on the 8th of August. I assume not July, unless we're in the middle of a YouTube void.
Yes.
So I think firstly, before I mention maybe a couple of policies I think the UK government has worked really well on that could well be replicated elsewhere, either by other countries or by other countries with the UK. I think the fundamental point that a successful policy lives or dies by is that point of trust that you mentioned earlier on, trust between government, between private sector, between third sector, and so on, and trust in all directions. I think we all need some humility here, whatever role we're in. And I think no one has all the answers on issues that we've been talking about today, misinformation and COVID. It's our collective expertise that comes up with the solutions. So it's really important that there's challenge in all directions. So such as Nicola's mentioned just now on UK legislation, I think it's really important to get challenge from partners on things like that. And I know you're aware, Nicola, and I certainly am, that this is something that's well recognized by the UK government, and they hear your voice and they understand the challenge there. In the same way they should, and we do, we should trust even more, such as fact-checking organizations such as yourselves that have done reports on 5G, such as last year. So we automatically take the kind of comment and conclusions on board, rather than slowly build trust over time and go, see, we had a report last year that was really good. You should now trust us next time. So I think trust is key in all these. Just maybe two kind of policy areas I think have worked really well, certainly with Poland, I think could be exportable. Firstly, I think sometimes you have to start with basics with things that are quite complex, such as misinformation, disinformation. So our Cabinet Office runs a really good training program called which is actually the resist model of how to deal with disinformation. And you can go online separately and literally Google it and find a whole presentation about what the resist model does in detail, and that can be useful not just for governments to use, but for anyone, I think. It's something that we did recently with the Polish government here, across the Polish government, and our Cabinet Office came out and trained the Polish government in this resist model, which in very short, kind of works on resist, meaning R for recognize disinformation or misinformation, E for early warning, S for situational insight, I for impact analysis, and then finally leading to S, strategic communication, and T, track outcomes. So a bit of a cycle there, but please, Google it separately and go into detail if you're interested. It's just a simple model that you can apply to many different scenarios of mis and disinformation, and that way you can, whatever level of expertise your country or your organization is at, you can pick bits of that model that work. So I think that's something that's worked really well here. And secondly, a program that the UK government also runs across Europe is something called the Open Information Partnership Program, which a couple of colleagues have mentioned earlier. And again, it has a website, and it's a way of linking up organizations in the third sector, particularly within countries. And I'm really glad there's about 5 Polish organizations within that. And not only do they kind of work, in this case in Poland, they work with the other 20 or 30 organizations across Europe. So they become a real network and they can share best practice. And again, part of that is they also get some really expert monitoring and training from organizations like Bellingcat, who are really renowned in this area. So they get mentoring as well as learning kind of peer-to-peer with each other. So I think that's also something that could be very much exportable. I'm thinking of my time in 3 African countries. Clearly, every country is very different, from Rwanda, Burundi being tiny, but in some cases like Rwanda having kind of 4G coverage and a government that can really get messages out there, to places like South Africa, which are really massive and have really different pockets of, whether it be poverty in some areas, but also real expertise. It's nearly in the G20, so there are definitely bits of those 2 models I mentioned that could be used there. Thanks.
I confirm. Actually, we used resist in our own works. Apparently, it's not as easy to find any universal type of model to implement it as a fact-checking of this information, whether something is or is not using it as a model. Resist is one of the most useful we have used so far, so I do confirm its usability. With that, I would like to ask one question to all here from our audience. Recently, there was a movie, Pandemic, which gained a lot of traction. I don't know if you might have heard about it, but sometimes certain disinformation or misinformation pieces, they do not get at all attention. Somebody posts it on Twitter and it is, and somebody maybe retweets it, but basically there is not much of a traction. Do we have all here, or he has disappeared in this moment?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear you, but we can't really see you. Okay.
Yeah, and I
anyhow,
see you, but I am here.
Anyhow, going back to the question, if you could tell us why, in your opinion, certain pieces of misinformation are getting distraction and some other aren't, could you please tell us what's the psychology behind it and why certain people repost something in such a dedicated manner as they do with Pandemic, and sometimes it's just there and nobody retweets it? What's your opinion about it? Olga, did you hear me well?
Yes, now I can hear. So I think it really depends firstly on a way it is shared. Honestly, Pandemic itself is a very catchy title. that can really help people to share it and click it. But also it depends on the strategy of communication, how such a message can be shared. For example, in Poland, the very big role was played by the closed Facebook group, which was called I Don't Believe in Coronavirus. It created kind of even small, a very exclusive group of even like a support group where people were sharing content which may be interesting for the others members of the group, but also they were prizing themselves for being, let's say, independent thinker. So they were not following the mainstream news that were, you know, asking you to wear mask or to watch out. They were trying to show that we are a kind of independent group which do not believe in this pandemic, in this global hoax, let's say. And this kind of a support from the others is also a very important factor because it enables you to share more and more very fringe and fake news content. And this was really visible, that for example persons who firstly just posted, you know, like a link with some very weird article, with that social acceptance for this kind of messaging, they felt encouraged to share more, and they were starting to create films, they were starting to create some infographics. So it's all also about the environment to which you are sharing the content. Twitter, it always depends on who follows you, who is following the account which is spreading fake news. The Facebook and closed groups are helping to group people, right, with the same attitude, same thinking, and this is the environment which really enables and boosts misinformation spreading. So this is first factor. Also clickbaits as the titles or some shocking images, they were also helping to spread the content. A lot Facebook videos with very big shouting titles, they were also much more shared than the others. So it's pretty simple. There's nothing like rocket science there. If you're using clickbait, you're using emotional titles, and you are targeting the correct group, then your content is shared. Basically, I've just told how to spread fake news, but this is how it works.
Yes, being catchy definitely helps. It's always good to have some kind of a group or network that helps you achieve your goals, even if you're a misinformation agent, but it also applies to the third sector that would like to prevent misinformation. And with that, I've got the third question to Nicola. The question comes as, just a second. What is the current state of cooperation between think tanks on the EU level, and do you think it should be strengthened, and if yes, how? As we have previously discussed, collaboration between the public sector and private sector and between countries as an international collaboration. Here is a question a bit different. Collaboration between civil society themselves as independent organizations of fact checkers.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what everybody else has said, that collaboration is really critical to tackling a lot of these problems. So there's the International Fact Checking Network, which is an international organisation that brings together fact checkers themselves and collaborates a lot. And they've been doing a really interesting project during COVID, where you can fact checkers who are part of that program can submit fact checks that they have done, and so they've created this database of fact checks internationally that have happened, and that's been really helpful from like a research perspective, that you can see what claims are being made in different parts of the world, but it also on a very practical level has helped fact checkers because we can check that and see if a claim that has made its way to the UK has actually already been debunked elsewhere, and it saves us time and it saves us resources. So on a very practical level, that type of collaboration is really interesting and really helpful. I mean, other collaboration that happens is kind of very much on the ground, I think. So I know that the EU has been trying to build greater collaboration between civil society in this space. I think there's still a way for that to go, and I think that could still be improved. And actually, I think talking to fact checkers and organisations who are out with those formal mechanisms, such as IFCN, it can be really, really beneficial as well. So you're not just staying within the same club, if you like. So yeah, collaboration is critical. I do think it could be improved. I mean, at PhilFact, we're trying as much as we can to do that. We've got a research project going on with Africa Check, who are in Africa, and Chequiado, who are fact checkers in South America, to try and get that international perspective. And so we're not just sticking to a kind of European viewpoint on some of these problems. So yeah, it's really important, but I think it could continue to be better.
And as I see, there is one more question, and it's to Pavel. As it was said before, I thought it was said by Nicola a bit more. There is a problem with the growing influx of misinformation and variety of topics. The data that is growing is becoming more and more complex to face, and the question goes as it is: how can we process so much data, and what is really needed from the perspective of fact checkers and civil society, so it can contribute to this checking as good as possible, and how to handle that much data as it is growing?
So first of all, as Nicola has mentioned previously, we as fact checkers are not experts on COVID, on pandemic, on science in general, because like we're tackling so many issues and so many matters that what we are basically doing, and what is the essence of fact checking, is reliability and being focused on what's trusted sources and what are experts saying. So we are going to WHO, to the Health Ministry and other organizations, CDC, to tackle this. So what I think could prove beneficial from the scientific side would be to get more involved in the process, in the fact-checking process. I do know that some organizations have easier approach to the experts, some others do not. It's also hard when you have this situation that, you know, everyone is working the hours for fighting this pandemic and infodemic, and sometimes you simply do not have time to respond to those questions. But I think more could be done by the health experts, by the experts in general, to have the specific knowledge on this particular case, not only on COVID-19 but also on 5G, on vaccines in general, to get more public. We need to have the science become influential again. And I think what we're seeing right now is that the science and the factual data is not sexy. It's not sexy, it's not attractive to general people, and we have to change it. We have to change it to get more reliable.
Well, how exactly to achieve this noble goal to make factual data and this, so to say, scientific language in sometimes complex issues attractive to people? This is a very important question, I guess, to be answered.
Yes, I think that
digestible.
I think we can fight this with the same strategy that disinformation, that misinformation is fighting against us. It's with usage of influencers and celebrities, but to promote the good agenda and good reliable data. Because if we can't if we can't make the official sources to be trustworthy for the general public perspective, for those who do not trust the government because of their political views or ideology, we have to come down to another solution. And I think that's what the WHO is actually starting to doing. But I think this would require a more systemic approach and more broadened perspective to actually be influential.
This is actually a very interesting practical recommendation to fight disinformation in a way it is fighting us, to employ certain, if I can say so, interactive or attractive means, such as memes, for example, or something that can be simply appealing to the average user somewhere on Facebook. I think this is something that should be done, and in this point, I fully agree. So as we move from the very yes, of course.
Can I just jump in for a second? So I certainly appreciate a couple of things that Paul just said about this is really just a question of ultimately trust. But and certainly there are these sort of interventions that can be really effective. But I do want to just say that I think we need to recognize that a lot of people who are within some of these, for example, conspiracy communities around 5G or anti-vax, it's not that they reject science, and it's not that they reject scientific experts. They just often appeal to different experts who might not be within the mainstream. I mean, this is why the pandemic is such a video is such a great example, right? There's a reason that's spread. I mean, New York did a great track the influencers who spread it, but also if you watch the video, right, it highlights, it includes this interview with this former researcher. I forget where she was, but she had a reputable institutional affiliation, and she made all these kind of about. But so I don't know. So I think we need to remember that it's not so simple as the this stuff don't believe in science, and we just need to get them to believe in science. It's true that they often do not have trust in mainstream institutional science, but often is a lot more complicated than just we can get them to believe in science, because a lot of them would say, I do believe in science. I'm going, I'm following where the facts are. Unfortunately, they just have a different set of facts.
But it's true that sometimes they jump out saying that we have our own experts, and this is expert versus expert, and especially when we think of this element that when Facebook tried to just flag a certain type of content as factually untrue, it has been shared even more than before, as it was a kind of confirmation bias to people who are generally distrustful towards Facebook. So if Facebook doesn't like something, it's a very valid reason to share it even more, because it's hiding truth from the people. So in this case, I see certain coherence between those two views. I guess this is a very important remark that should be taken into consideration when we also think of psychology of fake news and how to employ understanding and psychology in fighting it, so we do not make the same errors again as was with flagging of the fake news. It's very interesting to know how it was eventually resolved, making certain elements that were fake a little bit smaller than the real ones, and making the real ones as for example, a piece of information a bit more easier to click or a bit more appealing. That was an interesting take. But also sometimes the algorithm of Facebook were taught to display news debunking and real news next to the fake news article. So a person who wrote something, for example, that the pandemic was planned, will receive the content for the pandemic was planned, but also a dozen of other articles and videos claiming otherwise. It's something totally different. It's also a very good move in my opinion. We have moved from the very beginning of the problem, meaning what is misinformation and when do we spot it, through all sorts of problems, from academic standpoint to see how the public policy is tackling something, and what is the take of the public policy if it comes to collaboration with other entities such as social media platforms. And we have, of course, had some very interesting inputs from practitioners to see how to fight it, how to actually do things when we need to fight the misinformation. With that, I'm very happy that we had such a distinguished and interesting panel with totally different and mixed experiences. And we have such a multi-layer and multifaceted approach to fighting misinformation together. With that, I would like to thank you all once again. It was an amazing moments also for me to listen to what you conveyed to me and to our audience. And I would like to thank you, and I most sincerely hope that I will have the opportunity to talk to you some more and meet with you in a different environment as well. So thank you all. Thank you also to our audience and all the people who listen to us on YouTube. And stay tuned for our other webinars and events of the Kościuszko Institute and of the Atlas.
Thank you, Paweł. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I guess I can